All right, well, hello everybody, and what an honor to be a part of this event. You're going to be disappointed if you think that I'm going to follow up effectively to the three previous speakers, so I just want to set that expectation right now. But it is actually relevant. Everybody's talked about changes in the insight space. And this is a slide that my good friend Simon Chadwick let me borrow that he recently kind of mapped out the changes that we see in terms of the supplier community. So as you can tell, we're a very fragmented industry today. There's lots and lots and lots of new companies. To Catherine's point, the rising data tide and many of those data sources don't have much to do with traditional market research, but yet they are used to generate insights, and of course traditional market research fits in there, as well as lots of new suppliers who are changing even the definition of what market research is in terms of asking and listening and observing. So I set this to kind of set the tone that we're in a very disruptive, very innovative era within the industry, but yet some things are not necessarily changing, and that's what we're going to get to in just a minute, is what that change needs to look like. Now, amongst all of that, within the GRIT report, we asked folks, do you think that the market research industry will become more disruptive or less disruptive? Obviously, everybody gets it, right? Folks are expecting more disruption. They're expecting more change. That's good. We're not taking this blindly anymore. We understand what's happening to our industry. And then we ask, well, are you going to transform your business? And yes, folks get that absolutely they need to transform their business. Actually, when we look at this in terms of providers and buyers, it's almost a lockstep, right? So there's no illusions that previous slide that we saw on all of the different players, everybody gets it, everybody's changing. But there's some fundamental areas of the industry that are not changing. Some of those have to do with the role of automation. So this is actually from the most recent GRIT study. Ray did this analysis where we look at the adoption of automation technologies. We see that the analysis of survey data, charting, infographics, sampling are kind of at the top of the list. As Menica mentioned, analysis of social media data, certainly big from the client side. So we're increasingly kind of losing the human element of some of the research processes because automation makes it cheaper and faster. That's probably a good thing from a business standpoint, but is it a good thing in terms of our core asset, which is engagement with consumers? And we're going to get to that one in just a second. We asked sample providers what they expect to see is really disruptive to their business, and we see that single source networks like Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, those platforms that are engaging with consumers in a very different way than traditional panel companies are considered potentially disruptive, more from a threatening standpoint. Of course, the form factor of virtual reality replacing PCs and mobile over the course of the next 5 to 10 years is also something of great concern. And what that tells me is that there's a huge gap between how we as researchers think about the research process and how the tools that we use, meaning primarily online tools, how they'll be accepted by consumers. Because these things around single source networks, social media, virtual reality, these are consumer choices around the technologies that they use. They don't have much to do with research kind of forcing the business. So there's this latent buildup of potential disruption outside of just methodologies that are just as fundamentally disruptive to the research space as mobile and online was a few years ago. And I don't think that we're ready for that. And we have some data to back that up. Amongst all of that, we understand that there is still this ongoing debate about sample quality. Certainly that buyers or clients, almost a majority, think that it's getting worse. On the supplier side, maybe not quite, so bad, but still pretty bad. Folks that think that it's not necessarily getting better. Sample providers are the only ones who think the sample quality is getting better. So why is that? Why do we have this perception that the data quality that we're getting from consumers is not improving while we're gaining all of these other efficiencies in terms of the process, and we're experimenting with new techniques like Pete talked about, gamification, et cetera, et cetera. There's a real disconnect there. So, we wanted to find out a little bit more about this. And in GRIT, we asked a question in the previous round on how researchers prioritized different factors in designing a study. And what we found is that anything having to do with the respondent experience was at the bottom, absolute bottom, like embarrassingly at the bottom. And that really, really concerned us, that in thinking about study design and objectives, that the respondent was just not part of the consideration set. And that was equally true on both client and supplier side. I mean, certainly a little bit variance about, fair compensation, but not much. It was really an afterthought, if that at all. So we reached out to a bunch of folks earlier this year, and by we, I mean GreenBook. And we said, let's do a big global study of consumers, and let's ask them what they think about the research process. So we designed it as kind of the most cutting-edge study that we could think of. It's less than 10 questions. It was mobile optimized. We used a variety of sample sources, including traditional panels, mobile-only panels, communities, telephone, to try and get a good representative view globally on what we found. And what we found is that, consumers really think that the research experience kind of stinks. So if we look at just top two box, that's pretty pathetic. That less than a quarter of respondents actually were extremely satisfied or even moderately satisfied. If we even generously gave it to kind of a top three box, we're still less than 50% of respondents felt really good and satisfied with the experience. Now, some may argue that that's not our job to create respondent satisfaction, but I would argue that that actually in a fragmented marketplace where there's lots of other approaches that are embedded into the respondent experience and how they use technology and go about their daily lives, that this is a big deal for research, which tends to be more intrusive. So we run a real risk of disenfranchising the lifeblood of the research industry by not taking the respondent experience into consideration. So we asked a couple more questions. Does the design of a survey affect your willingness to complete it? Does working well on a mobile device, short in length? Yep, 55%. So it sure does. That if it's not a good experience for them from a design standpoint, they may bail. And I think we see that in the data on surveys and completion rates over and over again. We asked that what do they consider to be the ideal length to participate? Obviously, from this data, we can see that close to the majority were under 10 minutes, with a pretty sizable proportion, 1 in 5 minutes. There weren't a lot of folks clamoring for 15-minute surveys or even longer. So that's pretty telling as well. Consumers are not particularly enthused by the idea of participating in long surveys. Certainly not anymore, and possibly not ever, but we don't have that historical data. So, these are consumers telling us, no, it needs to be 10 minutes, and it needs to be a good experience. We asked why they participated in research, and to earn rewards or prizes, 36.6%, obviously. So there's not a lot of altruism involved in respondent participation in research. Generally, they're looking for some type of reward, with financial rewards being, the dominant model. It's not the only one. Fun, influence, et cetera, certainly are factors. But for the most part, folks are looking for a fair value exchange for their time. So I want to step back from that for a second, and now this is from the recent GRIT 50, and look at these companies brand themselves as being innovative, and that's what the GRIT 50 measures, is how well a company is determining themselves as being innovative. And it's pretty surprising that most of the big sample companies are here. They are trading on that idea of innovation. And I would argue that they are innovative. They are doing cool stuff. Pete, obviously, if SSI was talking about some of the experiments last week at IIEX, we saw lots of sample companies that were putting their best foot forward and thinking about new ideas of how to engage respondents to participate. But what we heard universally from all of them was that regardless of all the cool new stuff they're doing, the vast majority of their business is still dependent upon what could be characterized as fairly abusive survey research. Now, over 15 minutes, not mobile optimized, et cetera, et cetera. There was actually a panel where we had to discuss the how to push the industry forward to become more mobile compliant. Now, we're, Ray, 10 years in to the mobile era? You and I were arguing about this years ago. And we're still having this conversation about length of survey and being mobile agnostic, mobile device agnostic. And that's actually pretty pathetic from my perspective, that we're still having these debates. And we're seeing data now from consumers that are telling us, yeah, it's pretty pathetic and something needs to change. So even though we're depending upon these wonderful companies like Research Now and SSI and Lucid and YouGov, et cetera, all to try and drive innovation, we're not letting that innovation really flourish, and we're not giving them the power to really help the rest of the industry change effectively so that we can protect our most vital population, which is consumers. So, if we look at this now from a broader business standpoint, this is not just a process issue. This is a business success issue. So another component within GRIT was we wanted to establish a benchmark on the things that make businesses successful. And the dependent variable we used were folks that answered whether their budgets were increasing on the supplier side, on the client side, or whether their revenues were increasing on the client side. And we asked them to go through several exercises to kind of rank what makes things important. And one of the pillars of success that we found was good consumer connection, representative sample. So sample plays a part in the DNA of what makes businesses successful within the research within the research space. When we looked at things that were not considered to be important, obviously, price and traditional methods were very low on the totem pole. But on the borderline, an engaging experience for participants, it just barely missed out. It was at the top of the things that were not necessarily predictive, but it could have just as easily, with another point or so, been included in that component that is predictive. So the argument here is that folks that are successful in the research space, either on the supplier or on the client side, recognize, at least on paper, that producing an engaging experience is vital to their business success, not just to research data quality. And we see that when we ask people to prioritize, as part of that same exercise, certain things, quality of insights generated is obviously far more important than speed or innovation or price. So, we're saying that this is absolutely important to us, that we recognize that that we must do things differently to engage with consumers, but yet that is not showing up in the consumer data that we've seen. So what we came up with is a blueprint for the research industry, a few key elements that we think that everybody needs to focus on. First is principles. We need to build brands and relationships as part of the respondent experience. We need to be transparent. We need to be engaging, make it simple and clear. Focus on the user experience. These are key elements that the industry as a whole needs to step up and embrace. From an implementation standpoint, we need to leverage new technology, not just mobile, not just those traditional form factors, but we need to be thinking forward. What is it going to look like when virtual reality or augmented reality is kind of the defining model of how consumers engage with the world around them? We certainly today need to make it mobile first, not just mobile compliant, but mobile first. We need to keep it short. We need to deliver flexible and real-time rewards. People obviously want to be incented. They want a fair value exchange. And we need to ensure 100% data quality. And then finally, this CX focus, the customer experience. We need to put the respondent first. We need to let the respondent set the terms of engagement rather than us dictating how we think it should be. We should need to be respectful. We need to make it rewarding, and we need to create win-win relationships. So our belief is that this formula, if implemented across the board, if we embrace this as kind of a manifesto for what's necessary for success within the research space, by focusing on the respondent primarily and then back into the rest, that will establish a foundation for not just competitive advantage for the research industry as it's typically defined in a very fragmented and changing and disruptive marketplace, but also in redefining the role that we play in being the voice of the consumer, because they'll actually want to talk to us. And my belief is that today we are in danger of them not wanting to talk to us because, quite frankly, it's too much of a pain in the ass. So that's my manifesto. Thank you. And I think everybody knows how to get hold of me, so there's no need for to include that information. And Ray, back to you.